Excellent. Hello, Thomas.
Hello, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really glad we managed to get some time with you. I guess maybe I'll start with a brief introduction, and maybe you can introduce yourself as well. So, my name's Thomas. I'm one of the founding engineers at Speakeasy, and today I'm joined by Michael Heap, who is, I believe, the senior director of developer experience at Kong. But maybe you can explain a bit about that yourself a bit better.
Sure. That is, in fact, my title. It's one of those titles that doesn't actually mean much to anyone. But at Kong, it means that I'm responsible for looking at the experience people use the experience people have when they're using our products. So that's everything from do the products work well together? Do we have the right documentation? And even do we have the right tooling for things like automation, which is what led me to looking at the Terraform ecosystem.
And so, how did you enter this space as well? Like, what's a bit about your background that sort of led you to this position in Kong?
So I was an engineer for a long time. I'm currently working in the product management side of things. Kind of the first 10 years of my career were working in engineering. I think why I fell into that is I just like tinkering, building things, and that's actually what led me to APIs. You see, I'm actually very, very lazy, and I like automating things. There's a great XKCD about the time taken to automate things versus the payoff. I'm definitely on the spend more time than it would have taken to do it manually side. But I also get a lot of joy, like taking 1, 2, 3 different services and gluing them together in a way that they weren't necessarily supposed to be used. I'll give you a concrete example. A couple of years back, I was actually working for a company called Nexmo. They were acquired by Vonage. And if you're familiar with Twilio, very similar kind of product. And that year, I actually had to cook Christmas dinner for my entire family. And I was working away one day. I thought, how can I showcase this new WhatsApp API? I thought, what if I could put recipes in there and then just send it a message saying Christmas dinner? And then every time I had to do something like put the turkey in the oven, put the potatoes on, it would send me a WhatsApp message. So that's what I built. I got paid to do it. It was wonderful. Christmas dinner was a success. But WhatsApp didn't set out thinking, I'm going to build an API so that Michael can cook Christmas dinner on time. And that's why I got into APIs, because the flexibility of what you can build is just limitless. If you know how to glue two things together, you can solve problems that really only exist for you. And then, that turned into a career. And now I like to do it for other people.
I mean, that's fascinating. I'm very familiar with that XKCD, the cost to automate versus, the time given back, the ROI of automation. And I very much empathize with the feeling of APIs kind of enable this sort of, number one, high ROI for a certain kind of automation. But number two, it's kind of quite fun to just skip all the boring bits out and get straight to a WhatsApp message sending you your Christmas dinner. Maybe this is a nice segue into Kong, right? So Kong is a company very deep in the API space. Maybe you could give us like a brief introduction to what Kong does and kind of simple language as you can.
Sure. So Kong is an API company. We have lots of different products depending on whether you're designing and building APIs, whether you're running APIs, whether you're governing APIs. So I mentioned Vonage. My role there was about API governance. So it's nice to be on the provider side now at Kong. Kong started out as an open source API gateway. It's the most used open source API gateway in the world. And the product offering has expanded to cover Insomnia, which is an API design and testing tool. We have Kong Mesh, which is based on Kuma, which is a project that we donated to the CNCF. So it's a service mesh. If you ever used Istio, it's kind of like that, but much easier to set up. I guess the way to think about Kong, I'll give you an analogy here. Imagine that you're going into a building and there's someone on the door, and they're checking your credentials, they're making sure that not too many people get into the building at any one time. That's what Kong API Gateway can do for you.
And so I guess you've maybe skipping a step. You've worked specifically on the connect side of the product, right? Like this is like a subset of Kong. Is that right? Could you kind of let me know what the difference is between Connect and the rest of the Kong ecosystem is?
That is skipping a little bit, but I will forgive you. So Connect is the SaaS platform for Kong. So it's the quickest way to get started with Kong Gateway, with Kong Mesh. It allows you to run multiple control planes, which is where you store your gateway and service mesh configuration, just through one interface. It also has additional capabilities, things like managing API specs, publishing them to a portal, allowing people to register and generate credentials automatically. It's a full API publishing platform. So you can take Kong Gateway and run it on-prem, or you can let us do all the heavy lifting.
And so I guess maybe that's a nice tie-in to sort of developer experience. I guess you are director of developer experience. Like what does developer experience mean in terms of kind of Kong's products, and like how does Kong kind of value that internally?
So for Kong, it means that we're thinking about what we're building and how people will use it before we actually build it. So historically, for a lot of businesses, it's kind of been, let's write the code and whatever gets generated at the end is the interface. That doesn't work anymore. You've got to compete on experience as well. So now we map out all the use cases, what are they trying to achieve, and how can we make that both flexible but also simple. And it's always the trade-off between the two. And sometimes we go for a more complex data model to accommodate advanced users, and then we build tooling on top to simplify it for people just getting started. That's what developer experience is at Kong, thinking about the trade-offs between complexity and capabilities.
And is this kind of a maturity question? Like, is Kong kind of investing in this developer experience because it's kind of it has grown to a certain level that it's valued it more, or is this like actually very impactful to the business to focus on developer experience?
It's definitely maturity based. So when you're starting out, you probably don't want to be spending as much time thinking about what does this look like, unless you know there is a real need for the product. You shouldn't really be polishing it. The value that Kong gets is because we have a large user base and we have multiple products that all need to work together. So a lot of the value is we have this concept and we call it X in gateway and Y in service mesh. Why? Someone taking that holistic look at everything that we offer, looking for the commonalities and making sure that we're telling a cohesive story. There's a lot of value there. But that only happens with company maturity, once you have established users and potentially multiple products.
I mean, is there like an ROI equation that you guys are running internally where you say, okay, right, it's worth this much to invest in this kind of experience? Because obviously there's many investments that you can do to improve your developer experience. I'm kind of wondering if you could maybe take us into some of the internal thinking of like a mature API company like Kong. How are they deciding, like, should we invest in this particular thing or this particular thing? And developer experience is one of those investments. It's amongst many competing priorities. How do you kind of like justify it internally, may I ask?
So there are lots of ways to do this. You can start with the traditional ones like support case deflection. If you focus on fixing the experience and the number of people raising tickets goes down, you've been successful. Now, that's hard to quantify. Sometimes your customers are getting more familiar with the product just naturally. So it's very hard to prove causation rather than just correlation. But sometimes it's as easy as, if we can't manage all of our configuration declaratively, we're not going to purchase your product.
And I guess maybe that's probably a great segue into Terraform providers, where suddenly the intent is that the product can be configured declaratively. Could you kind of explain to us maybe what a Terraform provider is for those who might not be familiar, and maybe why you started getting interested in the space and kind of trying to add this value to Kong?
Sure. So a Terraform provider is something that lets you define your intended final state for a system in a fairly simple language called HCL, although it is more complex than it was when I last used it in Anger, which was a while ago now. But what you do is you define your intended final state, and Terraform will call all the various APIs and make sure that the state is what you expect. Sometimes that is creating resources, sometimes it's updating them, sometimes it's deleting them. But it keeps track of kind of what it thinks the existing state is. And then it calls the APIs to check what the state actually is, and then reconciles the difference.
So what was the impetus then, may I ask, to sort of go out and search for, I guess, Terraform provider vendors, or start researching, like, is it worth building this internally? Like, did you have like a trigger point, or was this kind of like a gradual pressure building internally that we need to have this?
It was a combination of things. So the first is that customers want Terraform. Like, they're already managing the rest of their estate with Terraform. They have existing tooling, approval workflows all defined. They just want us to slot into that. But the second part is Connect, the cloud platform that we mentioned earlier. There are new resources that are being developed that we didn't have a declarative story for. So we had to make the decision. Do we build something custom, like a CLI based on YAML files, or do we adopt something like Terraform? I think the answer will be both. But the first choice was Terraform, because it also met the customer need that we were hearing, where they wanted Kong to slot into the rest of the declarative pipeline.
And do you have any insight into what these customers were doing, I guess, before the existence or currently, because this provider has only been released without Terraform? Like, how are they managing these interactions?
So it depends on the customer. A lot of them are using Deck, which is Kong's declarative configuration tool. This is a first-party tool that is officially supported. It's in all of our documentation, and it works really well. So most of our customers are using Deck. Now, the reason Deck wouldn't work for Connect is because Deck operates within a single control plane, and Connect is like a collection of control planes. So it was just a different level of abstraction. So we either needed to build additional tooling on top, or start investigating something like Terraform, like I said. So customers use Deck. Some other customers used community Terraform providers. So community providers exist for Kong Gateway and for Connect. They don't have complete coverage because those people only build the resources that they need. And then there are a non-trivial number of customers that like writing bash scripts with curl in it, which I can't recommend, but I've seen it enough to know that it happens.
I'm on a personal note, I am one of those bash writing engineers. We have a scripts folder, and I get told off every time I add to it, and I keep doing so. So I empathize with the customers who just drop it in the script and move on. I mean, to dig into this kind of open source community provider question a bit more, were there kind of risk factors or like kind of worries internally about just saying, okay, right, why don't we just let the community support this? We release our API, and now we can just use a community provider, and we can just hands off, let the community kind of support themselves. Like, or was that kind of considered sort of a risky option, and it would be better to provide something official? How did you kind of make that call, or was that like a very obvious call?
So for Kong, that wasn't too risky. So Kong is an open source company. It has been since the beginning. So seeing the community build Terraform providers for our products was encouraging. We're in contact with the maintainers of those providers. They've joined our community Slack channels. So I wouldn't class it as a risk. I was actually quite proud that they'd invest their time to build things for Kong. That being said, we have a lot of businesses that use Kong that want that first-party support guarantee, and they will use a community provider. But if something doesn't work in the provider, they can just go and ask, raise an issue. Whereas if it is something that is supported by Kong, we have a support team, we have SLAs. They wanted that reassurance by having a first-party provider.
And I guess, do you have maybe like an estimated value in your head for the kind of the business impact of giving this reassurance through the public provider? Through a Kong maintained provider. Is this like something where the benefits it brings you are quite ephemeral, where customers seem happy as support tickets go down, or do you kind of expect maybe something more concrete, like it's going to immediately unlock a certain kind of enterprise sale, which might have been difficult to do before?
I think it's both. I think the ephemeral side, customers will be excited that we have an official provider. And I think that on the long-term side, we'll actually be able to go head-to-head with other vendors because we have the provider. So I think the effect for Kong is both the initial excitement and the long-term being able to hold our heads up high and say, yes, we support Terraform.
And speaking personally, I guess I'm quite proud to have built something and to have worked with you on this. I really hope that Kong sees some long-term benefit from working with Speakeasy. May I ask, before we get into kind of the relationship that Speakeasy has had with Kong in trying to be a vendor, build your provider, generate your provider as part of it, did you ever consider just building this provider by hand, and kind of what that would cost, or what the consequences of doing that would be versus using kind of a vendor?
Very briefly. So this actually didn't start out as an official project at Kong. This was something that I just started investigating between meetings. It goes all the way back to kind of 2022 when we decided to become a design-first company. So over the last 2 years, we've been designing open API specs for the experience It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. But I realised we had all of these specs, and I could start to think about generation for SDKs, for Terraform providers. I did briefly consider saying, hey, should we build one? Earlier in my time at Kong. So I was seeing the customer demand, but there was no headcount available. Like, Kong is innovating in a lot of areas, and Terraform is not our core competency. We use it a lot, like as consumers, but it wasn't something that would drive Kong as a product forward.
I mean,
so go on.
Oh, sorry. I always slight delay. May I ask, one of the common kind of questions that we have, or thoughts, concerns that people have when speaking to Speakeasy, is that they don't have any Go developers. And, the concept of building and maintaining a Terraform provider might actually be slightly out of sync with the way the organization is set up, because, well, now I need to kind of start hiring for a particular competency, which we just don't have internally. Was that the case at Kong? Or do you use Go quite a lot internally already?
We use Go extensively.
Okay.
We have a Goldfish channel for cross-team knowledge sharing, things like that. Only this morning, there was a discussion ongoing about, if I wanted to start a new project, should I be using Logrus or Zap?
Zap.
The answer was Zap.
Of course.
But yes, plenty of Go developers at Kong.
Okay. In which case, then, we know the answer. You chose to go with using Speakeasy to help sort of build and maintain this provider, using the sort of the design nature of the org and the open API spec that you put so much effort into, organizationally, kind of across everyone. But it seemed like it was, if you've got this Go team in house, you have this kind of core competency, that it seems like a maybe a harder decision to make than an organization that would be primarily Java based or primarily Ruby based. May I ask, why did you decide to use us? What helped us convince you? What worked?
This is an interesting question because I didn't originally set out to find a vendor. This was I think that having a Terraform provider will move the needle for Kong. I think I can do it in a way that doesn't impact our committed roadmap. So there's no churn for the business, there's no disappointed customers. And I think I can do it based on the investments we've already made. So the incremental cost to doing a Terraform provider, it wasn't give me 2 engineers and 12 months. It was sign off on this purchase order and I will give you a provider. Like, the actual cost to the business, time-wise, disruption-wise, was minimal. So that's why now was the time and why we chose Speakeasy as a vendor.
And so I guess you've described this sort of building on the power of having a very open API native organization. Is there something about open API which made it particularly appealing to Kong as like the interface format through which you kind of configure Speakeasy, versus, if we defined a YAML file or we had a ton of configuration in some other form? Like, what about open API kind of made this appealing, may I ask?
So we already have the open API specs. Like, it's the de facto standard. It's something that we were already using for some other tooling. The question about why use OpenAPI to configure Speakeasy versus a giant YAML file, that one I go back and forth on, actually. I generally decide that the OpenAPI spec is better, just because of co-location of the schema and the annotations. Teams might rename a schema or something like that, which ends up being a breaking change if you're generating SDKs, but that's another thing. But if they don't see the configuration annotations, they don't know that it has any impact. And then you spend 2 days trying to track down why things aren't working. So in this case, I think having the configuration co-located with the spec itself is helpful, especially for us as each team owns their own spec. So it's a federated design model. And we do some magic to combine them later for the provider. But yeah, having the config embedded in the spec allows us to distribute the config to all the teams that know their services the best.
I mean, I guess then if you've kind of had this wide distributed investment in your open API spec, may I ask how much effort it kind of took you to take this wide investment and start bringing it together into the Terraform provider through Speakeasy? And i.e., like, how much effort did this end up taking you? Like, what was the cost of Michael's time in really configuring this for the organization?
So I did this, again, between meetings across the course of about 4 months. But if I had to compress all the time that I spent, it was probably about 3 weeks from start to end. And some of that was realizing that our specs weren't actually accurate in some cases. One of the great things about Terraform is when you try and run it, if it doesn't work, it means your spec's wrong. So we actually had some side benefits of improving the specs for other use cases like documentation, in addition to actually getting the provider. But yeah, I'd say about 3 weeks.
And may I ask, did you have like any kind of expectation going into this that this would be much longer, much shorter, it'd be quite a rapid operation? Like how did that map to what you were originally thinking when you kind of saw Speakeasy as a vendor offering this?
So it was about a week quicker than I thought. I was hoping that I could do it in about a month of compressed time. That was assuming that everything worked as expected. As you know, we hit a couple of edge cases in generation, but you turn them around really quickly. Thomas won't tell you this, but sometimes it was the same day. And even some of the more complex things, it was a week, 10 days. So actually, if I tried to compress it, we probably wouldn't have got there in the month. But by doing it piece by piece, that actually gave us a couple of benefits. One is when we hit those edge cases, we could turn the fixes around, but also we slowed down and thought about what we're trying to achieve. So as an example, Kong has a plugin ecosystem, and the API accepts just a JSON blob for the config for the plugin. And had I been going 200 miles an hour, I would have just gone, make that type any JSON encode it, make it work. But actually slowing down allowed us to have a conversation with the Speakeasy team. Hey, how can we get some schema typing in this? How do we provide better errors to users? So I'm actually really glad that we did it over the course of a couple of months, because it allowed us to build that relationship with the Speakeasy team and use them as a sounding board for the design of the provider rather than just trying to get it out.
We are very happy to have supported you through that. May I ask, and maybe it's still too early to know, but what's kind of been the impact internally and sort of externally as you've released this? Like, have you kind of seen some form of uptick, other people interested in the organization, kind of like a bit of surprise perhaps that it's actually been done quite quickly as opposed to this initial sort of 12-month estimate or something along those lines?
So externally, it's still too early to see real adoption. But I have been on multiple customer calls doing demos and talking about how this is officially supported. So as soon as it launched, I got an influx of messages saying, hey, my customer wants this. Can you come and talk to them about it? So there's some validation externally there. internally, I knew it was going to be a hit. I know that our sales engineering team are using it. I think my favourite thing is maybe 2 days after I published the provider, I saw a bug report from one of our field team, so post sales, and they provided the bug report and the reproduction steps, but his reproduction steps were Terraform manifests 2 days after release.
Fantastic.
So that's the kind of impact that it's having internally. Like, they jumped straight on it and started using it in their day-to-day.
I mean, may I ask, you've mentioned already that your teams are quite Terraform native as consumers. Have they, like, is this an education thing for you internally where you're going to have to kind of educate them on what a Terraform provider is and what it means? Or is it really that you're starting to see that, boom, you've made this, fantastic, off they go. They're going to start running and building whatever they need with it.
It's the latter.
Fantastic.
So the team is already familiar with Terraform for other things. So they know what they're doing, configuring providers, writing manifests, using data sources, which is wonderful for me because they're already hitting things in the provider that I just haven't implemented yet, and the requests in the issues are going up. Feature requests, not bugs, I'm glad to say.
I should hope not.
They just want more.
Very good. And hopefully it's only a few annotations and, a little click of a button or run of a CLI command, and we'll get those live for them as soon as it's documented.
That's the wonderful thing about generation. Our commitment with our Terraform provider is any new feature we launch will be in the provider on day one. That wouldn't be possible without generation and the design first approach that we've taken as a business. Adding the new resources, like you said, my gut feel is less than an hour from I sat down at my machine to start working on this to the provider is published.
It's amazing. And I guess because you're not writing code, to an extent, there's a lot lower risk, right? Very few things can go wrong because it's a deterministic transformation of a JSON schema, an OpenAPI spec, to the resources, right?
It is. I do have one manifest on my machine which uses every single resource that I still run the provider through just as a smoke test. But so far, everything has been great.
You can probably automate that as well. There's a few of our customers put in smoke tests around each resource, and we've gotten quite lucky. We haven't seen any of those fail yet. But there is a really nice way to just ensure that when you make a PR and use Speakeasy Run to make the PR, that really that smoke test just runs and is a blocker to the merge. And when it's released, there's that confidence without even having to have yourself run kind of a manual smoke test. So maybe we can set that up soon.
I think that is the next step to get into that CI process.
All right, we probably ought to close this up. I think we're both in UK and it's starting to get a little late. May I ask before we finish up, what's coming next for Kong? What are you guys excited about internally?
So it's not necessarily next because it came out last week, but it is also next because it's the next thing I've got to get into the Terraform provider. So we spoke earlier about Connect, the cloud platform. That was a huge step forward because it's a SaaS platform. You don't have to run it yourself, do all the backups, maintenance. But it was only configuration. Like, you still had to run Kong Gateway data planes, so the thing that actually handled traffic yourself or in your own infrastructure. Last week, we announced Cloud Gateways, which is fully hosted data planes as well. So you can now use Kong Gateway fully hosted, control plane and data plane config and handling traffic. And it's been awesome to see things like AWS private link. So we can do transit gateways from our AWS account to yours. So fully secure proxy and go over the AWS network. I'm excited about this. because it means that as I'm building demos, I can use Terraform for the entire thing. Terraform for the gateway configuration, Terraform for the infrastructure hosted by Kong. Like, spin it up, tear it down, like 20 seconds before and after, and I have a demo in a box.
Hopefully, this will become a distributed thing across the organizations, and as different teams are releasing features, you can have a dev stream, a prod stream, and it all just automatically makes a provider and makes these features available immediately to our Kong customers.
It definitely will.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, Michael. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
No, it's been great chatting to you, Thomas.
All right. Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.